what's the process that you'll want to follow when you're mentoring? That's what we're going to have a look at in this presentation. So the objectives of this presentation are that at the end of it you'll be able to evaluate the mentoring process and how you'll conduct it, analyse the way to carry out meetings, and describe and assess ways of evaluating the process. The usual process for mentoring is in these 4 stages. Firstly, there's the preparation, then contracting with the student, and after that the meetings can be started. And then at the end of the placement there'll be the ending of the relationship and the evaluation of the experience. Let's start off by thinking about the preparation. In this exercise, list what preparation you'd want to do before contracting and meeting with the student. Here are some answers that you may have thought of. Firstly, is to ensure that you have all the information that you need about the student. The more information you have about them, the easier and quicker it will be to build the relationship and create rapport between you. Then, it's important to know what the outcomes are for all the parties involved. This means the student, the organisation, the university, and yours. Next is your frame of mind and attitude. As a mentor, it's important that you have an open, learning and curious frame of mind, and that you enter the relationship holding a positive attitude towards the student. Anything less than all of this will be projected onto the student and mean that building the relationship is going to be very much less easy, and there is a lessening of the chance of success. You'll want to have as much information as you can about the programme that the student is studying for. This will give you vital information about the type of work they can do, the learning they will already have, and what they need to do during their placement to complete the programme. And finally, you'll want to have prepared carefully the details of how you will want to contract with the student. Note down why you would want to contract with the student early on in your relationship. Why is some form of contracting between the mentor and the student important? Well, first of all, to ensure all parties are in agreement about the relationship. This is about managing expectations and making sure that everyone is clear about what's going to happen. It's also to ensure all parties are aware of their responsibilities in the process, so that mentor and student and everyone else involved knows who is responsible for what. It's to set boundaries for ultimate effectiveness. Understanding where the boundaries are from the beginning helps to ensure the success of the mentoring. It's also to set the details for the conduct of the relationship, to make sure that everyone is aware of the practical details of how the relationship will be conducted, and that there is no misunderstanding about that. And lastly, to make sure that everything is considered and set up at the beginning so everyone's outcomes can be achieved. Here are some of the formal contracting that will be important to take into account. There's the learning agreement, the contract of employment if they're paid, and the health and safety check. This next exercise is to help you think about the expectations and how you can manage them. Write down whose expectations will need to be managed, and then for each person write down what they would need to know in order to be clear about those expectations. At the minimum, you'll want to manage the expectations of you, the mentor, the student, and the tutor. For you, the mentor, you'd want to know what is required, what outcomes, what the process will be. So you have a clear picture of how it'll work and what your involvement will be and who is responsible for what. For the student, it will be about what will happen to them, what will be expected of them in terms of the work, what will they get out of it, what's the process, what support will they get from you, the mentor, their line manager, from their human resource department, or wherever the support may be coming from. What will be confidential and what will be reported, and who is responsible for what. And then there's the university or school's tutor. And they will want to have their expectations met by knowing when they can visit, who they can talk to, how can they get the information about the student's progress and welfare. What other ones did you find? The next thing to think about is about responsibilities in the process. The mentor is responsible for looking after the process, and that will include agreeing the agenda and the objectives. That is the overall objectives for the mentoring and the objectives for each of the meetings. And then they are responsible for using all their skills and experience to help the student come up with a way to move forward with their goals. They should only commit to being a mentor if they're prepared to do this. They're also responsible for empowering the student and, in a way, doing themselves as a mentor out of a job. The purpose of the mentoring is for the student to learn to handle things on his or her own. And finally, they're responsible to keep to any agreements that have been made between the student and the mentor, or, if for some very valid reason this is not possible, to let the student know. As far as the student is concerned, then they are responsible for their own learning and change. A mentor is not responsible for that. They cannot force the student to learn. That's entirely the student's responsibility. This is important for the mentor to remember. The student is also responsible for taking action. It is their results and their learning, and so they take the action. Some mentors have a tendency to do things for their student, and then the mentor gets the learning, not the student. It's important that the student reaches the objectives they want, but the whole point of mentoring is that the student learns. The student is therefore responsible for the results they get. A mentor needs to recognize this, so that they don't take on the student's goals. Not only is this not useful for the student, but it's very detrimental for the mentor. I've come across a few very stressed mentors who think it is their responsibility because the student is not achieving results, and the mentor then takes over. Not good. And finally, as a mentor, the student is responsible to keep any agreements that they have made, or to let the mentor know when this is not possible. Then there is the responsibilities of the university placement tutor. Their responsibilities are to monitor the student's progress, and this will be recorded usually as an interim and final report. They'll want to help in any way they can to ensure the student's welfare and well-being. They'll also want to ensure that the workplace experience is one that will fulfill the needs of the study program. And they will feed back their findings to the students and the organisation and will help resolve any issues that may come up. Now let's start to think about setting boundaries. It's useful to set boundaries at the beginning of the relationship. Firstly, there is the issue around confidentiality. A mentoring relationship works much better when what goes on between the two people is as confidential as it can be. So it's important to lay out at the beginning if there are any circumstances where you would want to break confidentiality. For example, if they tell you that they have broken the law, or if there are circumstances where you would want to tell their tutor about. Another one is to be very clear about when and how you can be contacted. Will this be restricted in working hours, for instance, or are you happy to be contacted at other times? I have spoken to mentors who haven't done this only to find that their student has phoned them up at home at a very awkward time when they didn't want it. Be very clear with your student about what things you can help with and those that you're not comfortable with. This helps because you can always refer them to someone else, but at least the student knows where he or she stands. It's important that the student knows when you meet or talk on the phone how much time you have available so that they can make the best use of the time you have. Do ask about any boundaries that they may have. For instance, there may be certain things that they don't wish the university to know about. Another thing you may want to consider, and that is if in your particular circumstances a written contract would be helpful for both parties. So what happens in the meetings then? Well, normally you will establish rapport, and the more you get to know your student, the less time this usually takes. Next, you'll want to talk to your student about what they've done since the last meeting. what's happened as a result of their action, and then what would they like to work through in this meeting. And so you'll agree the agenda and the outcomes. And then you'll work through the agenda with them. And you'll want to help your student action plan. And finally, it's often useful just to review the effectiveness of the meeting. What has been helpful? What is not so helpful? Do you want to change anything about how you're working together? In later sessions, we'll examine in more detail the ways that you can fulfill the different roles of a mentor in these meetings. And lastly, let's start to think about evaluating. Write down how you would want to conduct the end of the mentoring relationship and what you would want to evaluate in order to learn the most from the experience. So, conducting the end of the placement. This list is a combination of my own experience and from the literature on the subject. The first thing is about planning the ending in advance. That at the beginning of the relationship you have clearly defined the aims and objectives and put a timescale on it. Discuss in advance how you will know if the relationship is working or not and what will happen in either circumstance. Then you will want to review the objectives and how many of those have been met, how the objectives may have changed over the course of the mentoring, which objectives were set but not met, and what is the learning from that. It could be that as time has gone on, they were no longer relevant, or that they were not useful goals in the first place, or that the time frame wasn't realistic, or that the student has not been able to achieve them for some reason. Much learning come from reviewing this on both sides. It's important to acknowledge and celebrate the achievements, and you may want to think about what would be the best way of doing that. It's important not only to review the objectives, but all the learning. That means the learning in terms of the content, what the student has learnt about how to handle situations and progress, what you as the mentor has learnt from the student in these matters. It also means learning in terms of how to conduct an effective mentoring relationship. This is useful for both parties too, and particularly for the student if, as is common, they then become a mentor themselves. It's then useful to review with the student about their ongoing development needs and objectives and how those are going to be met. And the last part is to agree on how the next phase of your relationship will be. Will you want to support on a more casual basis, or would you like to break the relationship entirely? And what does the student want for this future? Here again, it's important for everyone to be very honest and open. I'm still in touch with many students that I have mentored and still enjoy that connection. So as a mentor, it's well worthwhile thinking carefully about this phase of the relationship. So what would you want to evaluate? Here are some things that you may want to review. Firstly, the outcomes and achievements for the student, for you, the organisation and the team. Then the learning for everyone involved. Then there's your development and growth as a mentor. And then there's evaluating the relationship between you and the student and you and the university. And finally, the impact on the organisation and the rest of the team in which the student was working.